This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Part of a Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode from Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken at K-State begins the show for today. The pair converses about why grass carp is an option for vegetation control in ponds, but also what people need to watch for. Today's show continues with K-State wheat production specialist Romulo Lollato providing his expectations of yield, diseases, and pests on the Kansas winter wheat quality tour. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk ends the show as he covers some of the factors dairy producers need to consider for replacement heifers. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show with part of a Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode from K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken.
Starting to get a lot of calls about weeds in ponds, and so along with that a lot of times comes the question of, hey, can we stock grass carp?
Sure.
So I wanted to talk about grass carp, some of the benefits, some of the drawbacks, and why you may or may not want to stock them in your pond.
Yeah, so I guess a little bit of history. Tell us about grass carp, where they came from. Are they native to North America?
Not native to North America. They're from Asia, and so we brought them over in the 60s, mainly as a research vessel. There was a big flood in Arkansas that occurred in the 60s, right after we brought them over, and near Stuttgart, Arkansas, they got released out into the wild, and they were able to reproduce some, and so that's happened in a couple other locations since then, and so they've just been kind of spread around, and now we actually introduce them a lot of times to ponds or certain bodies of water to kind of allow them to establish there. And so they've been in Kansas since about the 1970s. Okay. Mid to late 70s is kind of when they started to be observed in some of the waterways of Kansas. We've been stocking them for the last 30 or 40 years probably in a lot of private ponds. So kind of a little bit of history there and kind of what we're doing with them.
The ones that are stocked here in Kansas, are those the same kind that can reproduce, or are there any restrictions about that?
Yeah, so there's a characteristic called triploidy or ploidy, and basically we add some extra genetic material into the fish and make it so that they can't reproduce. And so the fish that you buy in Kansas to be able to purchase them legally are triploid carp. Now we say they can't reproduce. One of the important things is that there's a failure rate of somewhere around 0.1%. So it's not 100% effective. And when we're talking about fish that can make millions of eggs, it doesn't take very many to escape to be able to reproduce. And so making sure they're triploid, making sure you're buying them from someone where they've been certified is really important.
You said that you're starting to have folks reach out to you because they're concerned about plant problems and all that sort of thing. So how do you know when you have too many plants?
Yeah, I kind of tell people it's if you think you have too many plants, then you do. And so the rule of thumb is somewhere around 20 to 25% of your pond covered in plants. I'm a fisherman and a duck hunter. I like to be outside, and so I like to be around ponds that some people would think look ugly. They might have some cattails. They're going to have some submerged vegetation. To me, that means that pond is good from an ecological standpoint. So I think that looks pretty. Other people I go meet with, golf courses are a good example, where they want to have pristine waters and they don't want any vegetation out there, and they think that looks pretty. So it comes down to kind of what you want for your pond, what your desired outcome is. We talk a lot about having a goal for your pond. But as a rule of thumb, when you start to get more than that 25% coverage, that can start to be indicative of, hey, we better do something about this before it gets to a point we can't bring it back.
Sure. Is there a specific kind of vegetation that it makes sense to stock them for? And I mean, do they eat everything?
Yeah, vegetation falls into a few different main groups. And so emergent vegetation is one of them. And cattails are a good example. They have really wet roots or wet feet is what we would say. And then the plant itself grows out of the water. So they're going to be found around the edge of the pond or in really shallow water generally. You can have floating vegetation like duckweed and watermeal, and that, just like its name, floats on top. Submerged vegetation is going to grow almost exclusively underwater. So around here, coontail is a really common example of that. And then there's algae. And so algae is actually single cells. Sometimes they grow together and form colonies, so things like Cara. Filamentous algae is really common. People would call that pond moss a lot of times, so very common out there. Grass carp are really picky in what they're going to eat. So grass carp really, really like new shoots, so they like the young growth. If you have a established population of cattails out in your pond, putting a grass carp in there isn't going to do you any bit of good because they're not going to eat that kind of stuff, right? They'll eat a little bit of floating vegetation. They might eat some watermeal or duckweed, but again, they're not going to eat a ton of that. What they are good at eating, they like Cara, which is a type of algae. And they like some submerged vegetation, so they tend to be picky on what they eat. The other thing is, if they get a mouthful of something and they don't like it, they might go take 3 or 4 bites of a coontail, a submerged plant, and decide that one of those pieces is too tough. And so what they decide to do is spit it all out, right? And each of those little pieces that they have bit off can go settle back down into the substrate and propagate. And so I hear from people quite often that they stocked grass carp and they actually see their vegetation problem get worse, which is counterintuitive, but a lot of times that's the reason it happens.
Are there any other challenges associated with the grass carp? I mean, they're eating some plants and sometimes they're spreading things. Do they cause any other problems?
Yeah, especially when they get bigger, they cause quite a few problems. And so when they start to get really big, they just swimming around. So think about swimming where there's some muck or some mud at the bottom of a pond. They can stir all that up and make the water more turbid, make it darker. That can have cascading effects with how much sunlight we're getting to the bottom of our pond, how much plants growing. Some plants are good. They're giving off oxygen during the day, and that's important for the nitrogen cycle. So you can have all of that disrupted. One of the big things grass carp do is that they transfer nutrients. And so the plants that are growing are taking nutrients from the substrate and they're kind of holding it, in a form that the plant is utilizing. And they're going to grow and hold on to those nutrients so that it's only available to them. Well, if the grass carp eat those plants and they run it through their digestive system, when they excrete those plant material, those nutrients then become available to a lot of other things.
Sure.
And so you might have growth of algae or harmful algal blooms, cyanobacteria that can all come from that increase in nutrients. So, it doesn't seem like it would really disrupt things quite that much, but you start to see those cascading effects. And then to reiterate, they can, eat those plants and they can then propagate those pieces as they're moving them around. Maybe they're pulling it up by its roots and shredding it apart. And so they can actually make your problem worse if they're not being used in the right way.
If you recommended to somebody that they ought to stock grass carp, how would you recommend stocking them? How many, what size, all that kind of stuff?
How many grass carp you want to stock is going to depend a little bit on how much of an issue you have. And so if you have less than maybe 15% coverage, definitely going to recommend that you get out there with some other techniques. So if you get out early in the season and you use a rake or you're using a dip net or a parachute skimmer, they make special tools. So parachute skimmer floats along the surface, really good for floating vegetation. A weed razor is just like its name. It's a really long razor that can be used to cut weeds. And so if you have just a little bit of vegetation, probably wouldn't recommend using grass carp at all. Once you start to get in that 20 to 40% range, we're going to recommend a lower amount of grass carp. So probably in the 2 to 5 per acre is where we're going to live. And so I'm going to recommend that you put a lower amount in. If you start getting over 40%, 40 to 60%, you probably want 7 to 10 grass carp, maybe even a little upwards of there. But if you get over 60%, you probably have other issues in adding grass carp. They're going to die. They're not going to get enough oxygen overnight, right? And so those are kind of the metrics that I use, but understanding, what the problem is now and how we're going to address it. But then also, what are we going to do 5 years from now when you have a bunch of big grass carp, and what could those effects be? And so one of the things to keep in mind, if you put 20 grass carp in, you might get rid of your vegetation problem quicker, but you might have a problem that's 5 times harder to fix 3 to 5 years from now.
Sure. So, how big are these grass carp we're going to stock?
Well, when you stock them, the biggest thing that you want to think about is if you have any bass in your pond, you want to make sure that the grass carp are big enough that they're not going to get eaten. And so most of the time we're stocking them somewhere in the 7 or 8 inch range. Later in the season, that might get up to 12 or 14 inches. You don't want to stock them when they're really little. If you do that, bass are just going to gobble them all up. The other thing that can happen quite a bit is birds are really good at finding grass carp. Grass carp like to be up in shallow areas. And so you might have predation where, herons or eagles or even hawks I've seen come down and scoop some of these fish out. And so we want to make sure that they're big enough in that 7 to 10 inch range before we stock them to make sure the bass aren't going to eat them.
How do we try and make sure that they don't end up where they don't belong?
Yeah. One of the big things is that when they escape, it tends to be times that we're not thinking about it, right? And so some of these systems are really flashy, which means they can rise really quickly and fall really quickly. And so a good example of that would be if you have a pond and you go out and you catch, I've seen people catch gar in their pond and
Sure.
They wonder how it got there. Well, even though it might seem crazy, there might be a creek that's, 100 yards away that during a thunderstorm, a torrential downpour, floods enough to connect to these habitats. And some of these fish are really good at swimming when there's just a tiny amount of water.
Yeah.
So, a couple inches of water connecting one body of water to another might be enough for these fish to move around. And so understanding that connectivity is the biggest thing that we can do. Things like making sure our spill pipe, our emergency tubes where the water is going to be flowing out have fish guards on them so bigger fish can't get through is a really important thing to do. But having a plan in place, and then that's why we have that regulation to make sure that they're triploid. So in the unexpected event that they do get out, hopefully they can't reproduce into the native environment.
That was K-State's Joe Gerken and Drew Ricketts with part of a Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you after the break. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Tuesday show talking about the expectations of the Winter Wheat Quality Tour with K-State Wheat Production Specialist Romulo Lollato. Romulo, thanks for joining us today.
Good morning, Shelby. It's great to be here today.
Romulo, what is this Winter Wheat Quality Tour?
So the Winter Wheat Quality Tour, it's an event organized here by the Wheat Quality Council, right, that takes place every year around this time frame. It used to be in the first week of May. Now it's on the second week of May. And essentially, it's a tour for the wheat industry, right? So keeping in mind, these are not producers. They really are people involved on the wheat industry overall. So, for example, we might have millers, bakers, traders. We might have bankers as well as many people involved in just news release and reporters, right? And essentially, the idea of this tour kind of started back many, many years ago, trying to see what's going to be the overall quality of the Kansas wheat crop, the size and the quality of the Kansas wheat crop, right? How many bushels to expect, and should we expect it to be more on the high protein end and low protein and so on, right? And it became a tradition to do this tour every year. It has ranged from anywhere from probably 50, 60 participants all the way to over 100 here in recent years, right? But, it's an excellent opportunity for the wheat industry to network and to get to know more people that might be in related sectors. Is a great exposure to our Kansas wheat crop as well, since this tour gets a lot of traction. In the end of the tour, we do get an estimate of what the participants think the final production is going to be for the state of Kansas, and a lot of people are kind of looking forward to that as well. And for us in Extension, it's a good opportunity to educate folks, teach them in terms of what is wheat crop and what are some pests and diseases that impact it. So that's kind of the goal. We will go out in the state. There will be 6 routes going from South Nebraska to about central Kansas or so, leaving Manhattan, making all the way to Colby tonight. And, each car is probably going to do 15, maybe 20 stops And in each one of those stops, we'll do yield estimates and also get an estimate of what's going on in that crop, right? Whether there is any type of stresses going on, whether it is diseases or anything else. So, again, great exposure to the Kansas wheat industry out there, and a good opportunity to teach folks about the wheat crop as well. Folks that are involved with wheat many times, but perhaps have not seen how a wheat crop grows in the field.
Romulo, what are your expectations for yield as we kick off this tour?
Well, the season has been very interesting so far, right? We started off in actually pretty good shape overall. I think that looking at the last several years, if we look at early spring potential in terms of when the crop emerged and what the potential is looking like, this year we have been in pretty decent shape, really, compared to 2 years in the past. So my original expectation was that we would be on the higher end, right? But really, in the last 2 weeks or so, we have been exploding, particularly with wheat streak mosaic virus, right? And that is very concerning because that disease can really take a toll on our yields, and we are going to have to try and take that into account in our yield estimates as well. So I'm really looking forward to seeing, what's the frequency that we're going to see the virus in this trip, because think about it, right? By the end of the trip, we have probably 600 or 700 stops in fields across Kansas. And each one of those stops kind of telling us we're going to have a pretty good idea of how often there will be viruses out there. So, again, my expectation originally was for a fairly decent yield potential. And I think that some fields are, of course, still going to have that. But there will be cases where probably the virus is going to be significant enough that the potential will have gone down.
Are there any other diseases you're expecting to potentially find?
I've been thinking here that, based on some of the early scoutings that we have been doing, very likely we're going to come across some levels of stripe rust, depending on where in the state. I'm not too concerned that those will be extremely high. Thinking that there might be pockets out there that we may see some of it. Of course, we always see some tan spot and some leaf spotting diseases, Septoria, Stegonospora, and others. I wouldn't expect those to be taking a hit at the yield level across the state, but in some particular situations, like a no-till wheat-on-wheat type scenario, they might be more prevalent. I'm also thinking here, that parts of the state, even though the last couple of weeks have been excellent for the crop development in terms of cool temperatures and some moisture right across the state, there were parts of the state that missed this recent moisture. If you think of far northwest Kansas and far southwest Kansas, they have missed not only the recent moistures, but they have missed quite a few of the recent moistures events that we have had during the winter and spring. And so I'm thinking we're going to find some drought stress crops out there as well, in particular in those two regions that I mentioned, but probably in other parts of the state as well. Let's see what else in terms of predominant themes. I think, Shelby, that covers most of what we're expecting right now. Of course, some level of hail damage, right, we're expected to see as well, since we have had a hailstorm or two that came by. So, it's wheat and it's Kansas, right? So there's a lot of variability out there, and I think that's going to be part of the equation this year as well. The question here is how much that variability is going to impact our yields and how much really these incidence of disease, incidence and severity of disease, in particular, again, the wheat streak mosaic virus, is going to take a toll on our yields. And for farmers out there, what I would say is if you see a car stopping by and people walking into your field, please stop by. Please come talk to us. It's a great opportunity for us in the tour to really chat with you and understand what you're doing to the crop, what are you seeing in your own fields in terms of concerns, and it really enriches the tour when we have farmers who stop by, talk to us. Yeah, that would be my message to farmers out there. Please, if you see us in your fields, please stop by and come have a chat. We'll be happy to hear from you and learn from you and also tell you what we're learning. Perhaps even give you a little yield estimate for the field that we're visiting out there. As long as we're not held accountable, right, for that yield estimate, because too many things can happen between now and harvest still.
And as we're thinking about that wheat crop, Romulo, any expectation for finding pest or insect damage?
Regarding pest or insect damage, it has been fairly low this year. Of course, right, the wheat-root mosaic is transmitted by the wheat curl mite. We heard some reports of brown wheat mite earlier in the season. I think that with the recent moisture that we have had, that would have alleviated already, right? That typically gets worse under drought stress. So right now I'm not really thinking that we might see too many concerns in terms of insects. I expect that we will come across, aphids in these different fields, perhaps even some barley yellow dwarf transmitted by those aphids, but not necessarily at levels that are too concerned or that can cause a yield loss or a profit loss, at least based on the reports that we're hearing out there, right? It does not seem to be the most prevalent concern the growers have this year.
And we'll chat with you on the Winter Wheat Quality Tour tomorrow and Thursday as well. But if people are wanting to find another way to stay up to date with what's happening, what's your recommendation?
Well, absolutely. They can follow us on Twitter, right? Follow us on, that's typically where we're putting most of our information. So participants of the tour, they are very active on X, right? So go on and follow us there. Following my profile at KSUWheat can give you a pretty good idea of what's going on. I try to post photos of each field that we stop by. And, following the Kansas Wheat Commission there and the K-State Department of Agronomy on Twitter might be good ideas in terms of getting updated on what's going on in the tour as well.
Romulo, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Shelby.
That was K-State Wheat Production Specialist Romulo Lollato with his expectations of the Hard Red Winter Wheat Quality Tour. We will be chatting with Romulo tomorrow and Thursday to hear what he has been seeing on this Wheat Quality Tour. If you'd like to have more ways to stay up to date with what they're seeing, there's a few different ways you can do that. As he mentioned, you can follow Kansas State Wheat, which is KSUWheat on Twitter X. You can also follow K-State's Department of Agronomy, which is KStateAgron. Again, that is KStateAgron. You can also keep up to date through Kansas Wheat Commission, which their website is KSWheat.com. Again, that is KSWheat.com. I will link all these resources in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll be joined by K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk with this week's Milk Lines.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's Milk Lines. Making decisions about replacement heifers is an annual occurrence for dairy producers. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk discusses some of the factors that should go into making that decision.
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning replacement rates on their dairy farms as well as the size of their heifer herd. There's been a lot of discussion as we've gone to more crossbred animals and selling some of those animals into the beef industry and reducing the number of heifers that we produce on our dairy farms. And with that has come some situations where we maybe have had ourselves a little bit short on the number of heifers that we have available as replacements for our dairy herd. So what are some important things that you need to consider as you determine how many heifers you want to create on your dairy farm so that you have enough replacements for your total herd? So the first thing I would do is I would gather probably 2 to 3 years worth of data on heifer performance on your dairy herd. I'd also take a look at your replacement rate over that same 2 to 3 year period. So when we think of replacement rate, what we're looking for based on the number of lactating cows we have in the herd, how many culls have we had? This would include those that were sold as well as those that died out of our lactating herd in that 2 to 3 year period. The other thing you need to take into account is whether or not you've done some expansion during that 2 to 3 year period, or if your herd is fairly static. And as you look at the number of replacements you need in the future, you need to think about, will the number of lactating cows be expanding on my herd, or am I going to stay at the static rate? As we look at the replacement rate for most dairy farms, it's probably going to fall between that 30 and 35%. So that would be a number that we would need to know in terms of determining how many heifers we need each year. An important thing that is often forgotten is that when we're determining the number of heifers that we need in the future is what is the actual completion rate for our heifer herd. In other words, from birth through first calving, what percentage of the heifers actually complete that process? Because we need to add to that number that we came up with for our replacement rate if that's the case. Dr. Overton at the Western Dairy Management Conference recently gave some key stages or measures that we need to consider when we're looking at heifer completion rates. The first one that he suggested was the percent of heifers that conceive and actually calve. And again, that would be over a 2 to 3 year period on your dairy farm. Another factor would be the percent of heifers reaching 365 days of age that are pregnant at that point. So number of heifers that you get pregnant by 1 year of age is important. Then we also need to look at the percent of heifers that are sold between 91 and 365 days of age, the percent of heifers that died and are sold between 91 and 365 days of age, and then looking at the percent of heifers that are sold or died by 90 days of age. So those 6 factors need to be taken into consideration as we look at the number of heifers that we will actually need to create on our dairy farm in order that we have an adequate number for our replacement in our herd. Now, as you think about that, you may think, well, I do pretty well with heifers. Well, I find that if we actually sit down with the numbers, and again, looking at 2 to 3 years worth of data off of our dairy farm, we might be surprised at the number of heifers that do not actually make it to completion. And as a result of that, we need to think about how many additional heifers we need to create. That's going to reduce the number of crossbreds that we maybe want to create for the beef industry. I know that's tremendously profitable, but you really have to have enough replacements to take care of your needs on your dairy farm. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to take into consider not only the replacement rate on their dairy farm, but also the completion rate for their heifer herd as they determine how many heifer calves need to be produced on their farm in order to keep up with their replacement needs in their herd.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.